a new Middle East beats on I-24 News.
A very warm welcome to this edition of Middle East Now on I-24 News. And there has been a muted reaction across the Arab world today to President Joe Biden's decision to step down from the US presidential race. Well, compared to the many statements that we've heard from leaders here in Israel and across Europe, there was something of a deafening silence today in Cairo, Riyadh and Abu Dhabi. We'll talk a bit more about that in a few moments. But of course, Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is right now on his way to Washington. He is due to address Congress on Wednesday to talk more about all of that. Let's go to the US. We're joined by our senior correspondent, Mike Wagenheim. And Mike, first of all, in the last few minutes, we have heard from Kamala Harris. What should we call her, first of all? The presumptive nominee, the assumed nominee for the Democratic Party nomination? And what did she have to say?
She is the front runner for the nomination at this point in time. I don't know if presumptive is quite there yet because she hasn't accumulated the required number of delegates with which to clinch the nomination. So in Washington parlance, she's the front runner here at the moment. But she has coalesced a large number of endorsements, key endorsements, including from rivals or potential rivals for the nomination. So certainly seems like everybody within the Democratic Party, not everybody, but just about everybody rallying behind Kamala Harris at this point in time. In fact, after an event here just a few moments ago on the South Lawn, a sports-related event, she will be heading to Wilmington, Delaware, headquarters of what was Joe Biden's presidential campaign, now Kamala Harris's presidential campaign, where she will meet there with campaign staff. No word whether she'll come back to the White House this evening or not, but she's certainly being treated a bit differently than she was just, 24 hours ago, going from the vice president to the front runner for the nomination.
Very long time in politics, especially these days. Mike, what about Prime Minister Netanyahu then on his way to Washington? Who will he be meeting with? He'll presumably be meeting President Biden.
Laura, unfortunately, if you're still talking to me, I've lost your voice.
Can you hear me now, Mike? Ah, what a shame. We seem to have lost our Mike Wagenheim. We'll try and get Mike back up for you in a moment. Let me introduce my studio guest this hour. Shiri Fine-Grossman is a member of Forum Dvora, Women in Foreign Policy and National Security. Good to see you again, Shiri. We're also joined for the first time by Jean-Loup Sarman, Senior Researcher at the Middle East Institute at the National University of Singapore. I can guarantee that is our first guest all the way from Singapore, so welcome to you as well, Jean-Loup. And our very own correspondent, Zach Anders, as well. So let's talk about the reaction, Shiri, across the Arab world and, of course, here in Israel to the seismic political developments in the United States. What's your initial take on what's happening?
Well, I guess they're still contemplating on what the appropriate response should be. Look, there are connections between all the capitals in the Middle East with Washington, very strong ties, and they have their ambassadors there. It's safe to say a lot of them like Trump better than they like Biden, and I think they don't know enough about Kamala Harris to make a decision. I think Israelis don't know enough about what their policy is going to be, especially in the Middle East. I think, and that's something that we all feel, the lack of U.S. Willingness to go on the offensive and not just the defensive. We just saw the Houthis attack on
the same street as the U.S. consulate.
From so many, exactly. So many, events have occurred, and I think they're kind of still in shock, and they will have to be very careful here. But we know what kind of stand the Democratic administration had on human rights and things that are associated with the Middle East, a standard that they're more comfortable with Trump, but especially with Trump's son-in-law, Jared Kushner, who is very close with Mohammed bin Salman, the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, and all the rest of the Arab world leaders, including Qatar, by the way.
Jean-Loup Sarman, it's true, Kamala Harris is something of an untested quality, isn't it, when it comes to foreign policy? What are your initial thoughts?
Well, the problem is that the position of vice president doesn't provide with, let's say, a portfolio that would allow us to really test the credibility of Harris. I think the Arab countries are at the moment just waiting to see what it means. Would it mean more of the Biden administration or even more of the Obama administration, which is for a lot of those countries a big issue, a lot of concern. Plus, you can see with the reactions of let's say, the Arab social networks, there was not a lot of love for Biden because of his support to Israel over the last months in the war in Gaza. And a lot of the way the Arab social medias are looking at it is through that lens. That's for the public opinion. But with regards to the governments, I would say that there is a traditional preference for Republicans. That's a clear continuity with regards to the Arab government. So right now, I don't think this changes much. But in any case, they want to keep good ties with Washington, whoever is in the White House, I would say. All
right, Jean-Loup, for now, thank you very much. Well, let's go back to the US. I think we can get back now with our Mike Wagenheim. Mike, so Benjamin Netanyahu is on his way as we speak. Will he be meeting with President Biden, Kamala Harris? What can we expect?
Everything's up in the air right now. Now, before the events of yesterday, it seemed that the Netanyahu-Harris meeting was pretty solidified, while the Netanyahu-Biden meeting was more up in the air due to the president's health concerns over the last few days with him contracting COVID. Now it seems like everything is up in the air. There's been no further mention of a meeting between Netanyahu and Biden since the announcement came down yesterday that Biden would be withdrawing from the race. And now Harris is running a presidential campaign, something she wasn't doing some 24 hours ago. So I'm not sure if her first order of business tomorrow is going to be to meet with the Israeli prime minister. I wouldn't rule it out per se, but the priorities have certainly shifted here for the Biden administration. And keep in mind, Joe Biden is still in Delaware at this point. There is no telling right now when he will come back to Washington, how healthy he is at the moment. Nobody's seen him. Nobody's heard directly from him since he posted essentially a PDF letter on X yesterday. So there's so much right now undetermined. All we know at the moment is that Netanyahu is going to give the joint speech to the joint session of Congress on Wednesday. There is some talk that he might head up to New York or maybe down to Florida to meet with former President Trump, the Republican nominee. But again, if there's politics involved here, obviously, if you're not going to be able to meet with the Democratic side, well, do you really want to go meet with the Republican side? How would that look? Just the whole domino effect of things that we're waiting for them to resolve at this moment, Laura.
And Mike, just a word on what we know about Kamala Harris and her views on Israel. I have heard her described as the bad cop compared to Joe Biden's good cop when it comes to the Jewish state. Would you agree with that?
Somebody pegged her as, we'll put it this way, to the left of Biden and to the right of Hamas on Israel. I think that might be a good characterization at the moment. That's kind of where she stands right now on the spectrum. I don't know about the whole good cop, bad cop thing. I don't really know if that really was the game plan out of the Biden administration, because who looks to the vice president for that kind of role? It really isn't significant. I think she's developed her own thoughts and philosophies over time. You look at who she surrounds herself with. Her national security advisor is Dr. Phil Gordon, who hasn't always taken the rosiest assessments of Israel in the past. So her foreign policy very much undefined, and she hasn't needed to. As a senator, she didn't sit on any relevant foreign relations committees. As a vice president, she really hasn't had foreign policy under her portfolio, so to speak. And so those views are either evolving or they've been kept relatively close to the vest. She's given speeches on Israel in which she's talked about giving money in the old blue boxes of the Jewish National Fund as a child. She's had some good memories, some good stories she's relayed, but we've obviously seen the some of the troubling things that she said during the war as well. I think we'll learn more in the coming weeks and months here, and I think everybody can kind of make their own assessment from there if they haven't already. All
right, Mike, thanks very much. Appreciate it. Mike Wagenheim there. Well, let's get more now on the Arab world reaction to the news that the current Vice President Kamala Harris may be taking on Donald Trump for the White House in November. Here's our Middle East correspondent, Ariel Osserel.
أعلن الرئيس الأمريكي جو بايدن تنحيه عن الترشح لخوض انتخابات الرئاسة الأمريكية المقررة في نوفمبر تشرين الثاني المقبل.
Like pretty much everywhere around the world, the Middle East too was gripped with shock following Biden's surprise statement on Sunday.
أعتذر للمقاطعة. شكرا لك. ننوه الخبر سأعود إليك. يعني هناك خبر عاجل الآن على شاشة الجزيرة ننوه له خبر مهم وخبر في لحظة مهمة في تاريخ الانتخابات الأمريكية.
Naturally, the news ran on the covers of the region's major newspapers, but many believe Biden's election withdrawal makes no difference to them.
Since Obama, then Trump and Biden, we are still waiting for a president who will be fair to the Palestinian cause and consider it the central cause in the Middle East. Unfortunately, all of them proved to be the same, and no one was fair to our Palestinian cause.
In the Gaza Strip, where the U.S. is supporting Israel's war against Hamas, no cries of sorrow were heard. Some social media users took the opportunity to accuse Biden of being complicit in an alleged genocide.
What did President Biden do for the Palestinian people, the American people, and university students, and the demonstrations and protests that happened in universities? It was all against Biden. That is why, as we say in Arabic, he left before losing.
Notable were the reactions that weren't heard, mainly from regional leaders such as the UAE's bin Zayed, Egypt's Sisi, and Jordan's King Abdullah II. During the Biden presidency, many Arab leaders found themselves at odds with the veteran American head of state, mainly over their human rights records, but perhaps none more than Mohammed bin Salman of Saudi Arabia, which Biden vowed to make a pariah state last time as a presidential candidate.
The United States is clear-eyed about the challenges in the Middle East and about where we have the greatest capacity to help drive positive outcomes. Our objectives are focused, realistic, and achievable, so that we can target our resources, rebuild trust, and deliver real results.
But if you ask regional leaders, such results never came, like a regional alliance against Iran or Saudi normalization with Israel. Their belief is that under Biden, the United States reduced its presence and influence in the region, leaving moderate countries to fend for themselves in the face of an increasingly emboldened Iran. And so, with most regional leaders hoping to see Trump returning to the White House, Sunday's announcement could potentially risk that outcome, as it could pave the way for another Democrat, one who might only continue Biden's path in the Middle East.
And we'll talk a bit more about President Biden's Middle East policies in a moment. But I want to talk a bit more, Zach Andrews, about what will happen now in terms of process in the United States. Because if Kamala Harris is confirmed as the Democratic Party nominee, that won't happen before the convention, right?
No, and they're going to have to put together a ticket, you would just think. She doesn't have to. I mean, she could go into the convention and pick her vice president at that moment. They could have an open convention and pick the first place or the best horse in that race and say, okay, now you're the vice president to Kamala Harris. It's very strange. All of this is going to have a lot of moving parts. What's probably the most important thing right now for the Democratic base, people think that the polling is mostly done by Gallup and Reuters, and well, there's internal polling within the party as well. They can't put out a poll before any of this happened asking who would be most favorable to be a running mate for Kamala Harris, but that's most certainly happening now. They've probably got that poll in the field, and they're starting to understand a little bit more.
What kind of names are we talking about? Gavin Newsom, for example?
I think it's going to be tough because the Democrats are going to look at this and go, well, we're entrenched in a fight already. We can't pull any sitting governors out of states that we can't afford to lose. We can't pull senators out of, even if they have Democratic governors, we can't pull senators out if, like Mark Kelly in Arizona, if it could go red the next time there's an election. You look at the board, you have to win the blue wall, Minnesota, Michigan, Wisconsin. You have to carry those states. And you probably don't want to pull anyone away from those states either that's already sitting in office. So Gretchen Whitmer is kind of out of the equation, you would think. Plus two women on the ticket. There's a lot of things to go in here. I look at, well, when you go back to the 2020 election, who was it that released his delegates and dropped out and gave Joe Biden that boost before we got to Super Tuesday? And it was Pete Buttigieg, and gave a big showing of support.
Has he endorsed Kamala Harris?
We're still waiting on something from Pete Buttigieg. But when you go back to 2020, I remember there was a closed-door meeting.
Transportation Secretary.
Yes, and there was a closed-door meeting between him and Biden. And then it was at that moment he dropped out, endorsed Biden, and you have to be certain that he was promised something very big, and then he got to be the head of the Department of Transportation. But he has been rolled out on conservative media every single night. He has been playing interviews on Fox News. They love him, and he's really great. They can bat back and forth, and he's the one that they send out into conservative media to push the administration's message, and he's played very well.
But she needs to appeal to a certain demographic, doesn't she?
I think you can get away with a lot now. We're in the twilight zone already, and you could probably make a good case that, okay, you don't want to pull anybody away from any of these states. They need to stay where they are. Who's somebody that's a veteran that also checks a lot of boxes and pulls the progressives together, gets them really riled up? Pete Buttigieg is there. He's very well spoken.
All right. Zach, thank you. Shiri, so Prime Minister Netanyahu flying into this very complicated, almost unprecedented situation in the United States. I mean, how could this play for him?
First of all, I'm surprised he kept the trip. I have to be honest. It just I can't see how he's given attention unless We have some very big development when it comes to the hostage deal. There is a lot going on the ground in Gaza right now in Khan Yunis, it could be a decisive moment.
And he's taken rescued hostage Noah Agamani with him, among others, hasn't he?
Yeah, I mean, look, he's you know, it's Bibi. He's pulling all the rabbits out of the hat, and he put a hat on the table. If you saw it on the airplane that said the absolute victory or something like that. Yeah, he's probably going to talk about Iran. He's going to be October 7. He's going to talk about the hostages, about defeating Hamas, and now it's a big axis of terror from the Houthis, and the fact that how valuable Israel is to the Middle East. I'm sure that's all of that is kind of a given. Is in its talking points, but you know the interesting things that will go on will not be during the speech. These are the things that goes on, you know, in 4 or 8 eyeballs. That's always the key, and I think that's what we should look out to. If there's any development, you know, there's a lot of speculation that he was waiting for this trip, kind of to announce a deal. But that means everything has to be in play here. So these are important couple of days, I think, for everyone.
Do you think a deal could be announced while he's in the States and he signs off on it?
I mean, there's a lot of, I don't know. Like you said, everything is kind of is up in the air and up for grabs, but it could be because there's a very substantial operation going on in Khan Yunis right now, and these are really the decisive moments of this opportunity for a deal that can't be missed, like others were missed in the past.
And Jean-Luc, of course, President Biden is associated with policies that, you know, the Prime Minister Netanyahu has been very much against, trying to get back into the JCPOA, the Iran deal. When he came to power, President Biden called Saudi Arabia a pariah state. I mean, for many, he was going in the wrong direction in the Middle East. Do you think we could see a clash when Prime Minister Netanyahu arrives?
No, I think for the optics, they won't have an open clash, I guess, especially now that Biden is out of the competition. It's going to be a very strange visit in a way. The thing is that the Biden administration, for instance, on Saudi Arabia changed over the last 2 years. I mean, initially it had this very tough view on Mohammed bin Salman or on Saudi Arabia and even on the UAE. But we saw that in the last year, the Biden administration gave huge priority to the prospects for a normalization deal with Saudi Arabia. So I don't think that both sides right now, either the Biden team or let's say the Harris team or the Netanyahu team would be interested in, let's say, orchestrating a public clash. I don't think this would help in any way at the moment, either side.
But because of last time, of course, Prime Minister Netanyahu addressed the US Congress, he was criticized for undermining President Obama at the time, specifically on the Iran deal.
Yes, but the big difference is that at the time there was an imminent deal. Right now we don't have any serious prospect of a new deal with Iran. So, I mean, even if Netanyahu will probably emphasize the threat that Iran represents, I don't think actually that the Biden administration would disagree with the assessment that Iran's regional policy right now is a major issue. So even if Netanyahu goes this way, this would not antagonize the Biden administration, which honestly has not been really invested into renewing the JCPOA for a while. So it's not as if it was hoping for something on that file before the election.
Look, if I had to go into Congress, and I think, you know, a large portion of the reason he's doing this is because of the demonstrations we saw on college campuses, and setting a narrative, a certain narrative that, and I hope that narrative is twofold. A, that we in the West need to fight these anti-liberal ideas, right, that have nothing to do with human rights. They have everything to do, you know, with...
You're talking about Islamist forces.
Yeah, Islamist forces, but not just them, along with communist forces and all the kind of things that we're seeing in the propaganda out of Hamas. And you have to tie that to the right of Israel to exist, because when you say free Palestine and where is Israel supposed to go, and I think that's an essential part of his speech, to reconnect the narrative of why Israel is here and the right that it has to be here. And I hope it's part of the speech, and I presume it is.
Okay, all right. Well, some news here in Israel. The IDF confirming this afternoon that 2 hostages were killed while in Hamas captivity several months ago. The bodies of 76-year-old Alex Danzig and 35-year-old Yagev Buchstab are still being held in Gaza. The IDF has not revealed the cause of their deaths. And Shuri, there is a lot of concern that they may have been killed by Israeli military action. The IDF says it will investigate.
Yeah, actually, Hamas has actually announced their death back in March, and the IDF was checking this information, and now they have gathered enough intelligence to make a decision that this is correct and the official decision. So, you know, just thinking about the families that since March, since that announcement by Hamas has been not knowing whether that is true or false, and the agony and the suffering, the torture, mental torture that the families are going through is just horrific. This is not an easy dilemma for any decision maker in conducting the operation in Gaza and hoping that you know, the lives of the hostages are safe, and it's just awful. There's nothing, you know, we can really say here.
Yeah, and I'm wondering if Prime Minister Netanyahu will speak about the Americans who are among the hostages.
I'm sure.
5 Americans, of course, still being held in Gaza.
Yeah, I think, well, back to your earlier point about this speech as a whole, I think you could make a really good case that this is a very big risk, because there's a swell right now of sitting members of the House who are saying they won't attend. But more than likely, with the way that the House has behaved and the lack of decorum over the last several speeches, I think there's a very good chance for disruptions and for shouting and for booing. And this is going to play out as a television moment. There's a lot of very angsty Congress people right now who have been emboldened by the MAGA wing that has been booing State of the Union addresses now 3 times in a row.
We did just see a very strong show of support for Israel at the Republican National Convention, though, didn't we?
We did.
Prayers for the hostages and
this is going to look very different with both sides, with the bicameral House. It's going to be, I think, something very interesting to watch, and a lot of Americans are going to tune in, and everybody at home or in these Congress people's offices know that and are advising that, hey, you've got a really big audience right now. If the Prime Minister says something you don't like, you should let everybody at home know.
Yeah, all right. Thank you all. We're going to take a very short break. When we come back, we'll head to the north of Israel, where the Iranian proxy Hezbollah continues to attack, sending over unmanned drones today. We'll have the latest on that. Stay with us.
This broadcast is brought to you by Israel Bonds, the most direct and impactful way to support Israel. Invest now at israelbonds.com. This broadcast is brought to you by Israel Bonds, the most direct and impactful way to support Israel. Invest now at israelbonds.com.
Shalom. ¿Qué me trae por aquí? La necesidad impostergable de 600 millones de hispanoparlantes que ahora necesitan escuchar el mensaje judío e israelí en tiempos difíciles. ¿Cómo lograrlo? Cuento con ustedes para continuar llevando a lo más alto del mundo mediático una inquebrantable diplomacia pública al servicio de la verdad sin concesión alguna.
Welcome back. The IDF says it intercepted a number of drones which were sent across the border from Lebanon by the Iranian-backed group Hezbollah today. Let's get the very latest. Our Robert Swift is up in northern Israel. Rob, what's happening?
So it's relatively quiet at the minute. About 2 hours ago, there was 2 sirens going off back to back, about 3 minutes between them. And that had us running for cover with sirens going off in Kiryat Shmona, as well as several other surrounding communities. However, an hour later, the IDF sent an update saying that this had been identified as a false alarm. Not unusual, given the terrain here and the difficulty in detecting drones due to their small radar signature. But as you say, that wasn't the only incident today, with a successful interception of 7 drones earlier this morning around about 7 o'clock, slightly further to the east of Kiryat Shmona, around Majd al-Shams. The IDF said that it successfully intercepted 7 drones, with none being able to get through, causing any casualties or damage.
Rob, thank you very much. Robert Swift there, up in the north of...
We're just seeing an interceptor launching now. This is, you can see in front of us, one of Israel's Iron Dome missiles taking off. That's traveling in the direction of the north, meaning we've likely got rockets or possibly drones coming from that direction. Zil. And you can possibly just hear now the explosion of the impact. And our view is blocked from where we're standing, but that missile was launched from near the Kiryat Shmona area, one of the IDF's Iron Dome batteries, which are set up to defend the city, and it appeared to be going to the north, as I've said. Now, we have been expecting possibly some sort of Hezbollah action, because there was attacks by the IDF today going across into southern Lebanon, and there was one incident where the IDF said it dropped munitions on a building that appeared to be being used by Hezbollah. But another group, the Eagles of the Whirlwind, which is a group associated with the Ba'ath Party from Syria, that announced that one of its fighters had been killed earlier today. So possibly that group was connected to that incident.
Rob, breaking news there. Thank you very much indeed. Stay safe up there, Rob. Robert Swift in the north of Israel. Well, with me in the studio this hour, Sherifine Grossman from Forum Dvorah and Jean-Louis Saman, Senior Researcher at the Middle East Institute at the National University of Singapore. Our very own Zach Anders here with me as well. Jean-Louis, I'll start with you. We heard Rob there allude to the militias in Syria, and that is something we're seeing more and more of, isn't it? This coordination between these various Iranian-backed proxies and how they are attacking Israel.
Yes, and that's actually not something that started on October 7. You could see the opening of the Syrian front during the period of the civil war in Syria, with Hezbollah deploying forces there, training local militias, and deploying through the presence also of the Iranians missiles and rockets close to the Israeli border. So that is contributing to this multi-front scenario that we are seeing unfolding more and more by the day, and putting a lot of pressure on the missile defense systems of Israel, as we just saw on the video. And so statistically, that is the big question. I mean, as we saw last week on the night between Friday and Saturday, any defense system is not able to be 100% successful. So this, I think, is part of the calculus of all those actors, Hezbollah, Syrian militias, the Houthis, that putting this pressure on a constant basis against Israel, they will overwhelm eventually. That's their mindset. They will overwhelm.
Kind of a death by a thousand cuts.
Exactly, yes.
Strategy. Shiri, you were just telling me in the break then, you think that this increased coordination between the Iranian proxies will be, sounding alarms in Riyadh, and they will be more interested in a deal with Israel?
I don't think Riyadh can be any more alert or worried about what's going on in Iran, and they're seeing the capabilities of the Houthis, and they're not happy about it. They should be happy, and they probably are very happy about the attack Israel has conducted on the port of Hodeidah. Look, this is a constant battle. The fact that they, had a détente agreement brokered by China doesn't mean they're friends right now. There's a constant battle in the Middle East. It doesn't have to be kinetic. It doesn't have to be, with fire blazing everywhere. The struggle is still continuing, and for Iran, from the Saudi Arabia perspective, it's a constant battle, and Iran is constantly trying to undermine Saudi's stance and position in the Middle East. And that will continue to be so.
And Zach, you've spent a lot of time up there on the border with Lebanon, haven't you, seeing the rockets flying back and forth and the interceptions and all the rest of it. Now, the Biden administration was pushing for a diplomatic solution, pushing Hezbollah back north of the Litani River. Do you think that the changes in Washington will affect that strategy?
That's a good question. I'm not entirely sure. I think this is the Israeli element is the largest play here. They understand, the Netanyahu administration understands that what's happening now is unsustainable, and that the people will not move back to the north under the conditions where Hezbollah pre-war is able to sneak itself up to the border. As you understand the history of the last decade, understanding that 1701 was largely ignored is really a strange reality that it was ever allowed to be in such a capacity just because they weren't firing on northern Israel every day. The reality was that those Hezbollah assets, those rocket launchers, were positioned there below the 1701 line, the Litani. But what we have just witnessed, I think, in Tel Aviv the other night is the clearest example of why Israel cannot directly take on Hezbollah right now. That drone slipped through Israeli air defense systems and hit the center of the city and did not trigger an alarm. And we have seen time and time again that the biggest problem here is the drones. The drones have accounted for, I believe, the majority of the fatalities within IDF soldier ranks on the northern border fighting Hezbollah. The air defense system has mistaken its own drones, Israeli drones, shot their own assets down. We've seen from every angle, from the west to the east, that the air defense array that's supposed to be one of the best in the world, and also a display of U.S. equipment, the best that the U.S. can make, has not been able to take out these small little drones to sedan-sized drones that are packed with explosives. That's a real problem, and they've got thousands of them.
And the Russians are reportedly offering to sell them even more. So yes,
that's great.
That's perfect. Well, right. Yeah, the situation isn't getting better. Zach, thank you very much. Well, the other Iranian proxy group that has been in the headlines this week, of course, are the Houthis in Yemen. Israel carried out its first direct strike on the country this week. But why did this Shiite militia attack Israel in the first place? And how might they respond to the Israeli strike on the port of Hodeidah? Here's Ariel Osseran. He spoke with a former Houthi insider.
After over 9 months of missile and drone strikes targeting Israeli communities and bases, the conflict between Israel and the Houthis in Yemen just flew into another dangerous escalation.
عطفا على الأخبار العاجلة الواردة من محافظة الحديدة حيث طيران معادي يشن سلسلة غارات على مناطق مختلفة من مدينة الحديدة.
With Israel bombing the Houthi-controlled Hodeidah port, sparking a fire it claimed could be seen across the region, it sent a message to the Iranian-backed militia. And in an attempt to get a better understanding as to the thinking of the terror group amid this latest escalation, I-24 News spoke with Ali al-Bukhaiti, a former spokesperson for the Houthis.
أعتقد أن قصف تل أبيب ومقتل مدنيين إسرائيليين هو تجاوز للخطوط الحمراء لم تتجاوزها إيران، لم يتجاوزها حزب الله، لكن الحوثيين لأنهم جماعة لا يضعون احترام لليمنيين ولا يهمهم مصالح اليمنيين ولا اقتصاد اليمن، لا يكترثون لهذه النتائج.
Al-Bukhaiti served as the spokesperson for the Houthis until 2015, but left after they overthrew the government in Sana'a and began oppressing their opponents. Speaking to I-24 News from London, he says the Israeli strike in Yemen, its first since the start of the war, won't deter the Houthis from further striking Israel.
على العكس الرد الإسرائيلي هو في صالح الحوثيين لأنها قصفت ميناء الحديدة ومحطة الكهرباء وأماكن تخزين النفط وهذه كلها منشآت مدنية ولن تتضرر جماعة الحوثي بل ستتمكن جماعة الحوثي من تجنيد الكثير مستخدمة الصور وجثث الضحايا الذين قتلتهم إسرائيل بالأمس. لو إسرائيل استهدفت مواقع عسكرية خاصة بالحوثيين انطلقت منها طائرات أو مسيرات ولو بريطانيا أو الولايات المتحدة حتى قتلوا عبد الملك الحوثي سيكون كثير من اليمنيين سعداء، لكن استهداف البنى التحتية والمدنية وقتل مدنيين هذه جريمة حرب.
وماذا عن الرد الإسرائيلي؟ هل تعتقد أنه سيرضى الحوثيين عن استمرار الضربات ضد إسرائيل؟
يجب أن يتم حل مشكلة الحوثيين حل جذري. للأسف أن الولايات المتحدة وبريطانيا والاتحاد الأوروبي أوقفوا في عام 2018 معركة تحرير الحديدة وكانت القوات اليمنية بالتعاون مع السعودية والإمارات على وشك تحرير الحديدة والساحل اليمني. الغرب وأمريكا هم الذين أوقفوا هذه العمليات. اليوم العالم يدفع الثمن، ليس فقط إسرائيل إنما العالم والسعودية وأمريكا وكل العالم. ولن نتخلص مع الحوثيين إلا إذا حلينا المشكلة من جذورها وأسقطنا سلطتهم في صنعاء وليس حرب بالقطارة هنا أو هناك لا تضر إلى المواطن اليمني البسيط.
The Houthis have continued to launch these reckless attacks with no regard for the well-being of innocent civilians who are transiting through the Red Sea, and now they have unfortunately and tragically killed innocent civilians. So we will continue to hold them accountable, and we call on governments around the world to do the same.
But as the former Houthi spokesperson says, 9 months of continued coalition strikes on the Houthis have not deterred the group.
لن تؤدي هجمات الولايات المتحدة ولا هجمات بريطانيا ولا حتى الهجمات الإسرائيلية لتغيير المعادلة. الحوثي جماعة متطرفة يختبئ قادتها في أماكن مختلفة ولن يتأثروا بمعاناة اليمنيين، بالعكس سيوظفون هذه المعاناة وازدياد الفقر في اليمن لتجنيد عشرات الآلاف ومئات الآلاف في صالحهم، وبالأخص أن وجدان الشعب اليمني والشعوب العربية والإسلامية كما تعرف متعاطف مع القضية الفلسطينية، ومن هنا الأفضل هو اللجوء إلى تحالف دولي لإسقاط سلطة الحوثيين وحل المشكلة من جذورها.
And so, with Israel joining the fray and striking Yemen directly, it hopes to deter the Iranian proxy from further striking Israel. But according to their current and former spokespeople, that is not likely to be the result.
Well, joining us now, Dr. Walid Faris is a foreign policy expert and the author of several books, including Iran, Imperialist Republic. Great to have you with us, Walid. Thank you for joining us. So the Houthis attacked Tel Aviv on Friday night. Israel responded with its first ever strike on Yemen, an attack which turned the port of Hodeidah into a giant fireball. Is that the end of the matter, in your view?
Not at all. We are in the middle of it, and let me start with actual, strategic umbrella on the analysis. This is not just the Houthis attacking Israel. It is, practically speaking, of course, and Israel responded, as you have just detailed. It's Tehran. It's the Khomeini's regime in Tehran that is the grand orchestra of these 5 militias in Iraq, in Syria, in Lebanon, in Gaza, and a little bit in the West Bank, and of course in Yemen. That's why in the report that proceeded right now, you see something like the Houthis actually try to calculate that there will be an Israeli response. They know that. Lobbing one missile, just one missile on Tel Aviv, they know what they're going to get. But it seems that these are pressing strategic orders from Tehran to harass or to pressure Israel, and on a much larger scale, Tehran knows what's going on in the United States, and now the U.S. is more and more paralyzed internally because of what we know, the political campaigns, and therefore they do not expect a massive American reaction, but they do expect that the Israelis are going to hit back. Would the Houthis continue? Yes, as long as they are pressed by the Islamic regime of Iran, they will continue to do so. The real question to me is, the Israeli strategy is the idea that hitting the infrastructure of the Houthis, in fact, which is now part of the Yemen, would that yield results? Divided are the opinions here. Some would say, yes, the economic factors in Yemen will pressure the Houthis to stop, including Houthi businessmen and business people. And the other view says, yes, that would encourage the Houthis to continue the attack. So the jury is still out on this.
Do you think that in Tehran they were expecting such a robust and direct response from Israel?
I'm sorry to say yes, because the Islamic Republic intelligence services, their assessment, they're all over the place. They are in the U.S. and maybe also in Israel. They know how the Israeli high command would think, but not of this dimension in the beginning. That's my assessment. They thought that there will be counterstrikes by Israel on some headquarters of the Houthis, bases of the Houthis. But what Israel has done, seen from the outside, is not just the value of the attack. It's the pictures, it's the videos of the attacks. I followed what happened around the Arab world, from Lebanon to Iraq, to including in the Gulf. The pictures that were sent, that these flames are a real deterrence. Final deterrence, I don't think so, but a real deterrence, forcing the Houthis to speak with the Iran regime and tell them, look, what is the next step?
Well, meanwhile, we've got the Lebanese Prime Minister Mikati in Baghdad meeting with Prime Minister al-Sudani. Now, these are two men whose countries have been taken over almost completely by Iranian-backed proxies, yet there they are calling for restraint. What do you make of it?
That's a typical, classical good cop, bad cop, meaning the militias are striking, engaged in warfare. And the prime ministers and the governments that they control, who controls Lebanon? We just mentioned it, Laura, is Hezbollah, and the PMF or the Hashd controls Iraq. And they have good-looking, normal prime ministers, the facade of prime ministers who would, once the militias attack Israel, to stop an Israeli counterattack on them, they deploy their prime ministers, let's have a ceasefire. I mean, this is something that most of the observers in the Middle East would know. This is not serious counter to Hezbollah and the Hashd. This is a display by Hezbollah and the Hashd. They told them, say so.
And before I let you go, Walid, how do you see the developments in US politics affecting what's happening here?
Wow, that's a big deal, depending who's going to be the last candidate standing, meaning who's going to win. Now, the battle, of course, is within the Democratic camp. I have not seen anything like that for the last 30 years, and I'm sure the Israelis are very familiar with that. But once we have the two final candidates, once the Democrats will produce the final candidates, we know what Donald Trump think about it. It's going to be a major choice or change of direction in terms of politics. If it's an Obama / Biden / whomever they support final candidate winning in November, we're going to go back to the Iran deal, and probably with the Muslim Brotherhood deals and so on and so forth, and 4 more years of what the past 4 years were. Frankly, if it's Donald Trump, he's going to go back also to 2017 to 2000, but probably in an updated way.
Yep, there is a lot at stake. Dr. Walid Fares, we appreciate it as always, author and co-host of the War and Freedom podcast. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
And with me in the studio, Jean-Louis Saman and Shiri Fine-Grossman. Jean-Louis, your reaction to what you just heard?
Well, with regards to Yemen, I share the pessimism in the sense that what we know from the war in Yemen over the last decade is that the Saudis, the Emiratis, and the Americans have not been able to deter the Houthis. So I don't think we are seeing the last chapter of this tit-for-tat strikes. The problem we see actually is that the Saudis and the Emiratis have been quite ambiguous on this issue, actually, because they have been frustrated with the reactions from the Biden administration over the last years with regards to the war. So as a result, they are not part of the U.S. operation against the Houthis. So the Saudis and the Emiratis right now are considering that they may actually be in a better position to have their own deal with the Houthis, which is basically just a non-aggression deal. And that's why I think the situation is quite complex in the sense that I don't see the Saudis, the Emiratis, the Americans, and the Israelis as a unified front against the Houthis. This may change if we see more strikes, more escalation. But as of now, I think Riyadh and Abu Dhabi are trying to stay away from that escalation.
And seeing as you are based in Asia, what about China's role in all of this? Do you see China playing a stronger hand in the region?
Not so much. I mean, with regards to the Red Sea crisis, what we've seen is actually the same as the Saudis and the Emiratis. Basically, the Chinese have been negotiating with the Houthis a non-aggression deal, which was basically do not target our ships. Beyond that, I mean, we've seen that the Chinese diplomats are interested in having group photos right now with Hamas and Fatah, or in the past with the Saudis and the Iranians. But beyond just displaying this type of very high-level statements or meetings, the Chinese are not really involved and not really interested, actually, to replace the Americans when it comes to mediation. We didn't see the Chinese so far involved really seriously on Gaza or any of those issues at the moment, Lebanon, Yemen, or so on. So I think they are at the moment considering that it's better for their relations with the Arabs, with the Iranians, to stay away from the issues and just sign non-aggression deals with who's firing at the ships right now in the Red Sea.
Pretty smart policy. Shiri.
Look, I'm concerned, I have to say, about Israel's reaction, because I don't want large resources taken away from the primary goal right now. And the primary goal is to finish the job with Gaza, is to bring the hostages back. While doing that, that would probably most likely lead to a cessation of the exchange that we're seeing up north, and it will, and then we'll have to get to the Houthis and Hezbollah. I'm not saying we didn't have to react. I'm just concerned how we manage
allocate
this reaction.
resources. They are finite after all. Shiri Fine-Grossman, Jean-Luc Saman, thank you very much indeed to you both.
Thank you.
Now, Iran and Sudan have exchanged ambassadors, bringing to an end an 8-year diplomatic freeze. It comes amid growing concerns that Iran is supplying drones to both sides in Sudan's bloody 15-month conflict, which has pitted the army against the RSF militia. Tens of thousands have been killed and some 10 million displaced. Haitham Hassanein is adjunct fellow at the FDD, the Foundation for the Defence of Democracies. Thank you very much for being with us, Haitham. Good to see you. Tell us then, why was there this diplomatic rift between Iran and Sudan in the first place?
Thanks for having me, Laura. It dates to 2016 when Saudi Arabia and Iran broke out ties after Saudi embassy in Tehran was attacked. At the time, Sudan showed solidarity with the Saudis by cutting ties with Iran and even deploying troops to Yemen to fight the Iranian-backed Houthis.
At exploiting war-torn countries, is that what's happening here?
For Iran, one of the main interests in restoring relations with Sudan and have some influence in the country is its strategic access to the Red Sea. Having access to eastern Sudan and above all Port Sudan provides Iran with a considerable channel of influence. Not to mention, it could potentially flip the country into a proxy territory like Syria, Lebanon, and Yemen and utilize that for political gains at the expense of surrounding Arab countries and other regional powers as well. Plus, it could cut the road to any future diplomatic relations between Khartoum and Jerusalem.
Egypt, of course, has been trying to mediate in this very brutal conflict between the Sudanese army and the RSF militia. Is Cairo getting anywhere at all?
There hasn't been much progress. Cairo has been trying to host both contesting sides, but nothing reached out yet. Even tried to utilize the efforts by the Arab League, and things are not working as well. So the war continues, and people keep dying every day, and nothing has been reached, unfortunately.
And tragically, the human cost of this war in Sudan is absolutely staggering, isn't it? I alluded to it in the introduction. Some 10 million people displaced, many of them at risk of starvation. Yet this war receives very little international coverage. I would imagine that in Egypt, this is a pretty serious concern.
I agree, because what happens in Sudan doesn't stay in Sudan, especially from the Egyptian perspective. It does affect the national security of the country in terms of regional competition with other regional powers. Also does affect it in terms of immigration. Lots of refugees and lots of Sudanese escape through the borders and come to Egypt, and this puts lots of pressure on the internal economy and creates issues for national security agencies because of human trafficking and drug dealings and smuggling and all these kind of issues. So this is something Egypt has not been comfortable with recently. Especially also Sudan is considered historically the backyard of Egypt, and Egypt has a track record of managing the situation there. But seemingly the past few years, Cairo has not been successful to manage it this time.
And I mentioned at the beginning of the programme, there has been very little reaction from the Arab world to the news coming out of Washington over the past 24 hours. Any idea where Cairo stands on a possible incoming President Harris?
I think the official line is they will just have to wait and see. But what I could say is, in the past, there used to be a personal relationship between President Sisi and President Trump. So based on that personal relationship that was created between the two sides, I would argue that the assessment could be that you could sense where they could be standing when it comes to the presidential elections in the U.S.
Yeah, we can read between the lines, can't we? Hi, Sam. Great to talk to you as always. Thank you very much indeed. Hi, Sam Hassanein there at the FDD.
Well,
that brings us to the end of tonight's show. Many thanks for watching, and do stay with us here on I24 News because Kalev Ben-David is here next with tonight's rundown. Good night.
Shalom. ¿Qué me trae por aquí? La necesidad impostergable de 600 millones de hispanoparlantes que ahora necesitan escuchar el mensaje judío e israelí en tiempos difíciles. ¿Cómo lograrlo? Cuento con ustedes para continuar llevando a lo más alto del mundo mediático una inquebrantable diplomacia pública al servicio de la verdad sin concesión alguna.
A new voice is about to be heard.
אתם צופים בערוץ החדשות I-24 News.
I-24 News launches its fourth channel in Hebrew, broadcasting 24 hours a day, 7 days a week.
ותיעדו את הטבח.
I-24 News in Hebrew brings its international success for the past 10 years to Israel. Real-time news, sharp analyses, and passionate debates on the burning issues shaping Israeli society and the entire Middle East. And for you, English-speaking viewers, I-24 News offers a unique, immersive experience. Every day until 11 a.m. EST, Hebrew programs will be broadcast live with English subtitles. And from 11 a.m. EST, back to your favorite shows in English. More than ever, the heart of a new Middle East beats on I-24 News.
This is the rundown on I-24 News. I'm Khaled Ben-David. A political earthquake in the U.S. with profound repercussions throughout the world, including, maybe especially here in the Middle East. U.S. President Joe Biden's shock decision to drop out of the race just a month before the Democratic National Convention has reshaped the political landscape, making Vice President Kamala Harris the likely contender to take on Republican candidate Donald Trump in November. The bombshell announcement by the 81-year-old Biden came at a critical time in U.S.-Israel relations, with the president scheduled to meet Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu Tuesday in Washington, a day ahead of the premier's speech to a joint session of Congress. We start our coverage with senior correspondent Bianca Zanini assessing the Biden legacy in the White House, including his policy on Israel that ranged from strong support to what some might call tough love for the Jewish state.
I, Joseph Robinette Biden Jr., do solemnly swear.
That was 4 years ago. Today, the picture looks very different. Following weeks of internal pressure and rumors that Biden, aged 81, is no longer capable of holding office, the president announced he's dropping out of the race. After 5 decades in politics, Biden's 4 years as president were defined by global and international challenges, perhaps even more than domestic. The COVID pandemic, the end of America's longest war in Afghanistan, Russia's war in Ukraine, and of course, perhaps the most damaging element, the war in Gaza.
My commitment to Israel, I want to make clear again, is ironclad.
Biden has been quick and consistent in his support of Israel, including with large weapons packages and in some cases actively participating in thwarting attacks against Israel. But his steadfast support for his ally has drawn growing criticism.
Palestine will be free!
Both on a national level, with widespread anti-war and anti-Israel protests at college campuses across the country, but also from within the Democratic Party, almost from the get-go.
Look, this has been a long time coming, not the explosion of anti-Semitism, not the creeping extremism of the far left of the Democratic Party, but the fact that there's been a real role change. When I was growing up, the Democratic Party was the party that supported Israel. 75% of American Jews vote for the Democratic Party. That is still the case, although I suspect it may not be in November of this year. And very slowly, but very surely over the last 20 years, that has changed. It is a sign that the Biden administration is run by a man who is 81 years old, right? Because he is of the old school of the Democratic Party. Almost nobody who works for him is.
Biden might have hoped that by supporting Israel unequivocally, he could influence the American allies' decisions in the war, but it wasn't smooth sailing.
So there's a lot of things, in retrospect, I wish I had been able to convince the Israelis to do. The question has been from the beginning, what's the day after in Gaza? And the day after in Gaza has to be, the end of the day after has to be no occupation by Israel on the Gaza Strip.
Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu exposed the widening gaps between the two allies when he openly criticized the Biden administration for withholding weapons shipments. The U.S. denied this was a policy, but acknowledged delaying one shipment because it didn't want Israel using the weapons in a potential full-scale attack on Rafah in Gaza. But for many Democrats, these gestures pale in comparison to the nearly 40,000 Palestinians killed in the war. For weeks, Biden has tried to get Hamas and Israel to agree on a ceasefire for hostages deal that he proposed in the end of May.
6 weeks ago, I laid out a detailed plan in writing. It was endorsed by the UN Security Council, the G7. That framework is now agreed on by both Israel and Hamas. So I sent my team to the region to hammer out the details. These are difficult, complex issues. There's still gaps to close, but we're making progress. The trend is positive, and I'm determined to get this deal done and bring an end to this war, which should end now.
This week, Netanyahu is visiting Washington and will meet President Biden to discuss the war.
At a time when Israel is fighting on 7 fronts, and when there's great political uncertainty in Washington, I will seek to anchor the bipartisan support that is so important for Israel. And I will tell my friends on both sides of the aisle that regardless who the American people choose as their next president, Israel remains America's indispensable and strong ally in the Middle East.
Netanyahu's visit and the following 6 months in office pose a significant test to Biden's legacy. Will he be the leader that helped secure a ceasefire in Gaza and end the war?
Now, while European and other Western leaders were quick to comment on Biden's withdrawal from the presidential race, leaders here in the Middle East have been somewhat subdued so far. Many of them have had tense relations with Biden and now fear that his withdrawal could pave the way for another Democrat who might beat Trump, their preferred candidate. Our Middle East correspondent Ariel Osseran has more on that.
أعلن الرئيس الأمريكي جو بايدن تنحيه عن الترشح لخوض انتخابات الرئاسة الأمريكية المقررة في نوفمبر تشرين الثاني المقبل.
Like pretty much everywhere around the world, the Middle East too was gripped with shock following Biden's surprise statement on Sunday.
أعتذر للمقاطعة شكرا لك ننوه الخبر سأعود إليك يعني هناك خبر عاجل الآن على شاشة الجزيرة ننوه له خبر مهم وخبر في لحظة مهمة في تاريخ الانتخابات الأمريكية.
Naturally, the news ran on the covers of the region's major newspapers, but many believe Biden's election withdrawal makes no difference to them.
Since Obama, then Trump and Biden, we are still waiting for a president who will be fair to the Palestinian cause and consider it the central cause in the Middle East. Unfortunately, all of them proved to be the same, and no one was fair to our Palestinian cause.
In the Gaza Strip, where the U.S. is supporting Israel's war against Hamas, no cries of sorrow were heard. Some social media users took the opportunity to accuse Biden of being complicit in an alleged genocide.
What did President Biden do for the Palestinian people, the American people, and university students, and the demonstrations and protests that happened in universities? It was all against Biden. That is why, as we say in Arabic, he left before losing.
Notable were the reactions that weren't heard, mainly from regional leaders such as the UAE's bin Zayed, Egypt's Sisi, and Jordan's King Abdullah II. During the Biden presidency, many Arab leaders found themselves at odds with the veteran American head of state, mainly over their human rights records, but perhaps none more than Mohammed bin Salman of Saudi Arabia, which Biden vowed to make a pariah state last time as a presidential candidate.
The United States is clear-eyed about the challenges in the Middle East and about where we have the greatest capacity to help drive positive outcomes. Our objectives are focused, realistic, and achievable, so that we can target our resources, rebuild trust, and deliver real results.
But if you ask regional leaders, such results never came, like a regional alliance against Iran or Saudi normalization with Israel. Their belief is that under Biden, the United States reduced its presence and influence in the region, leaving moderate countries to fend for themselves in the face of an increasingly emboldened Iran. And so, with most regional leaders hoping to see Trump returning to the White House, Sunday's announcement could potentially risk that outcome, as it could pave the way for another Democrat, one who might only continue Biden's path in the Middle East.
And let's go now to Washington, D.C., and our senior U.S. correspondent, Mike Wagenheim, who's there at the White House. And, Mike, it may not be the first thing on the mind of people in Washington, but here in Israel, certainly, people want to know, is President Biden, after that shock announcement, going to meet tomorrow as scheduled with Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, who's touching down in Washington today?
The Prime Minister's office, Khaled, continues to insist that meeting is moving forward. However, no word and no spotting yet of President Biden in Delaware. The White House press office called a travel lid about a half hour, 45 minutes ago, which means we don't expect President Biden to return to Washington tonight. That leaves a short amount of time and still concerns about his health. His doctor said in a note yesterday that his symptoms were lessening. His health was improving, but still 81 years old with COVID. It's not a guarantee that he can turn around after 5 days, head back to Washington and hop back into meetings of great consequence. So PMO says it's going forward. It's already listed what it expects or what it wants out of that meeting, including more freedom to operate along the so-called Philadelphia corridor and other security measures in Gaza. Still no word from the White House. And by the way, Kamala Harris, who was supposed to meet with Prime Minister Netanyahu tomorrow, well, she's hitting the road today to head up to Delaware to what was Biden headquarters, now I guess Harris headquarters, to speak with campaign staff up there. Still, we expect the meeting tomorrow, but again, this is a much, much different White House than it was just 24 hours ago, and the priorities for Kamala Harris that existed yesterday may not be the same tomorrow. I'm sure everybody can understand that at this point in time.
Well, they certainly can, Mike. Plenty of time for her to get back to Washington. But of course, then the question is, Kamala Harris, is her path, especially after so many major Democrats have come to support her, some of the names that had been floated as possible alternatives, does she have a clear path now completely to the nomination?
I wouldn't call it a crystal clear path, but certainly much improved than it was when the initial announcement from Joe Biden came out. I mean, everybody that she could have expected within Congress, I think at this point in time, to back her has done so, except for Hakeem Jeffries, the minority leader in the House of Representatives. He still hasn't given any kind of endorsement out yet, and he was considered maybe a long shot for the nomination to begin with. But the coalition has certainly coalesced around Harris at this point. She's already some 25% of the way to getting the requisite number of delegates to clinch the nomination. She's the presumed front runner at this point in time. And listen, I think you look at the money at the end within the time of Joe Biden's announcement yesterday. Act Blue, the Democrats' online fundraising mechanism, had its biggest day ever, almost $50 million at last check coming in donations online. So I think from every indication, it's Kamala Harris's race to lose at this point in time.
Right. We'll talk a little more about her later. And speak of one of those delegates, those Democratic delegates, Mike Wagenheim, at the White House. Thank you for that. And joining us in studio is Ambassador Avi Pazner, the former Israeli ambassador to France and Italy, former world chairman of Keren Hayesod, Lieutenant Colonel, Reserves Lieutenant Colonel in the IDF, Doron Avital, former commander of Special Forces in the IDF, a former member of the Knesset as well, and our correspondent, Zach Anders. Avi, Mr. Ambassador, I'm going to start with you. You knew Joe Biden, dealt with him. You also served in Washington and served with Prime Minister Shamir here. I guess you've had plenty of contact with Joe Biden. Your thoughts on his stepping down? And one thing to keep in mind, that when a president, he's got 6 months to go, and when a president becomes a lame duck, as Ronald Reagan did in his second term and recognized the PLO, Barack Obama, they suddenly maybe feel a little more freedom to take moves that might not do if they were running in re-election, including on Israel.
You're absolutely right, Caleb. Of course, now I would not call President Biden a lame duck, because he now, on the contrary, he's a liberated politician. He can do now what he really wants to do. And I hope it will go in our direction without the pressure on the left side of his Democratic Party. And it is, of course, a personal tragedy for Joe Biden. And I have to tell you, Caleb, I think I said it here also, the day after the debate, I said that Joe Biden cannot be elected. You cannot be elected when you stumble on your word, when you cannot finish a sentence. And I don't say that he's diminished in his intellectual capacity, no. But somehow, cognitively, he was not there anymore. But still, he is the mighty President of the United States until 20th of January of next year. And we are in the middle of a war, and we have to continue to deal with him. And I think now, I don't want to be at Netanyahu's place now. He has to make some political and diplomatic acrobatical move between Biden, Kamala Harris, Donald Trump.
Right, who is also scheduled to meet.
Yes. Yeah. You know what? It is very fishy. Many Israeli politicians tried to interfere in American elections, starting with Yitzhak Rabin, who helped Nixon in '72, Ezer Weizmann, who helped Carter in '80, our friend Benjamin Netanyahu, who tried to help Romney in 2012. What will Netanyahu do now? I mean, will he support Trump more openly than he did until now, in spite of the fact that their personal relationship is not there anymore?
Right.
Will he try to help Kamala Harris now? Because, you know, it's not a shoo-in. I heard your correspondent. But, for example, President Obama did not endorse her.
Right.
Maybe he wants Michelle Obama to run for president.
Well, I think we'll leave that for the side. We'll discuss domestic politics, but let's just bring it back to the region, not just Israel, the region, because President Biden had big plans for the region, Doron, this Arab-NATO alliance against Iran, normalization with Israel, Saudi Arabia. Does this take it off the map, or maybe, as Avi suggests, it frees him up to make some bold moves?
I think it's still on the map. I think when you think about the Biden doctrine or the Biden initiative, the corridor, whatever, you might think about it as the second flaw of the Abraham Accord, which we owe to Trump. So I think whoever would be elected, and the next 6 months will be also critical in the battlefield, I think still the strategic move that the U.S. would push is what we call Biden/Trump/Kamala Harris initiative, which means this corridor, normalization of Saudi Arabia, but also making progress with the Palestinian. And I think those pillars of American strategy to the Middle East would not change. The question is, how would Bibi play with this kind of a strategy?
All right. Well, he's dealt with similar situations with Barack Obama, and there was some tensions there, and certainly in the final months of the Obama presidency. Now, with most leading Democrats now following President Biden's lead in endorsing Vice President Kamala Harris, taking his place at the top of the election ticket. It does seem, I would say almost certain, she will face off against Donald Trump in November as a Democratic candidate. It's a nomination that Harris failed to get in the 2020 presidential primaries, and the polls taken before Biden stepped down showed that Harris was also trailing Trump by a few percentage points. As the first African-American woman to top a national ticket, she would be making history, but voters will be scrutinizing her record, including on Israel. Let's take a closer look in this report. Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, I'm sorry. And no, instead, for more, we're going to go back to Washington, D.C., speak to someone who also knows Joe Biden and Kamala Harris. She is Jennifer Mizrahi, the co-founder of the Mizrahi Family Foundation. She was the founding director of the Israel Project Advocacy Group, and she is one of the over 4,600 delegates to the Democratic National Convention next month that will officially choose the party's candidate for president. Jennifer, thanks for joining us. First of all, I want to just ask you, I saw one of the statements you put out said you were literally crying when on the news of Joe Biden stepping down. Explain that. Why were you in tears?
You know, I wasn't in tears because I thought it was the wrong thing to do. I thought he made absolutely the best decision for the country, but I'm just so grateful for him for how much he has done for our country and the world. The first time I ever met him, Caleb, was at an APAC policy conference when I was a college student in 1985. So I've known him my whole adult life, and he has just served our country so well that it's just heartbreaking, you know, sort of like when you have a parent who's aging and they can't drive anymore. It's heartbreaking, but I'm so grateful to him for his leadership.
Right. Now, you also put out a message. You're already in the camp supporting Kamala Harris. I want to ask you how, if you think she has a clear path or completely to the nomination. And as I mentioned, you were the founder of the Israel Project, a pro-Israel advocacy group. Her record on Israel is going to be scrutinized. There are some, even within the Democratic Party, who say, and certainly Republicans are going to make this claim, that she is softer on Israel support, for example, than President Biden.
So first of all, let me say that I do think she has a very speedy path to the nomination. There were a lot of other unbelievably talented people who were mentioned as potential presidential candidates, you know, different governors, senators, et cetera. Almost all of those folks have already endorsed her. My state party had a major meeting this morning with our governor and our state chair, and literally every single person who's a delegate said they're for Harris. So we had a vote unanimously. We're all behind Harris, and we see this is happening all across the country. Now, as to the question of Israel, she is a strong supporter of Israel's right to exist. She has held firm against Hamas, and she is personally engaged with American families who have hostage, family members who are being held hostage by Hamas. And when the squad, some members of the squad were doubting some of the atrocities like rapes that had happened by Hamas terrorists, she stood up to the squad and put together a special forum to really push forward the actual facts of what was happening, really pushing back against, some of these more liberal members that were not taking into account the facts on the ground, so to speak.
Right. Now, you, in your resume, you were also a political strategist, communications consultant, largely for Democrats. So what advice would you be given for Kamala Harris in a general election against Donald Trump? As I mentioned, and of course, the polls could have changed now after this announcement. But prior to that, she was polling about the same as Joe Biden, trailing Trump in a few percentage points in those key swing states.
Well, we've had some really dramatic changes in the mood here in America. First, we had this assassination attempt against Donald Trump, which was horrific and should never have happened. Then we had his speech at the convention where he started off talking about unity, but then he went off the rails as an extremist yet again. Listen, she's a former prosecutor running against a perpetrator. She is standing up for women's rights against a candidate who literally has lost a court case because he raped a woman. We have all kinds of issues around climate change, where he is for the big oil and gas companies and doesn't understand the threat of extreme weather, where we have people in America literally dying from the heat. So there are so many different issues that she can talk about where she has serious credibility. So I look forward to her really focusing on the issues, because there is just so much there.
All right. Well, sound like you've prepared some talking points for the vice president already there. Good luck at the Democratic National Convention, which is going to turn out to be a lot more exciting than maybe you anticipated it would be. Jennifer.
Absolutely.
Jennifer Mizrahi, thank you for joining us on I-24 News.
Thank you, Caleb.
And Zach, as you hear, certainly I would say Jennifer kind of represents the base. She is a, like I said, veteran Democrat, strategist, advisor, member of the Democratic National Convention. They're charged up. The question is whether Kamala Harris will be the first woman of color on the top of a presidential ticket of a major party, is going to be able to close that gap with Donald Trump in the coming election.
The last several months of all the polls that we've seen have been head-to-heads, and there have been a few exceptions to that rule. There's been polling done about if Harris was to go against Trump, but all of those polls are asking those questions to people, respondents, who in the back of their head are still seeing Biden on television every day and not Harris on television every day, seeing Biden as the front runner and being asked those questions first. So I think the polls are definitely going to be skewed. And now that there is a change, the polling is going to change very rapidly. I think we're about to see some very quick shift inside the American populace. There's already been released today by some CNN tracking. They have this neck and neck. This is an entirely different race, and they haven't even announced who the Harris running mate is going to be. They're going to do internal polling, the campaign is, about who's going to be the best pick. The Trump ticket is set. Everything about that is in stone. This still has some room to grow, and there's a lot of opportunity for the Harris campaign to make some big moves in the coming months. The convention isn't until late August. We've got
August 19th, I think it starts. But big endorsement just came in for Kamala Harris. Nancy Pelosi, the former House Speaker. Some believe she is still the most powerful Democrat.
And Gretchen Whitmer just now, too.
Well, Whitmer had already indicated I think she would. So that means she's not going to run against her. I want to go back to the point that we heard in that early report by Daniela Pletker, Avi, that Joe Biden represents an older era of the Democratic Party where support for Israel was taken for granted. Despite what Jennifer said, there are some concerns. Well, certainly supporters of Donald Trump think she could be soft on Israel, but even others wonder, certainly, how much she would be able to, as you say, stand up or resist against the progressives, the far left of the Democratic Party.
You know, I still have my interrogation points about Kamala Harris, I must say, as I have about Donald Trump, too, who is unpredictable. But in the last 8-9 months of war, Kamala Harris was the most outspoken member of the administration on the plight of the Gaza.
And calling for a ceasefire.
And calling for immediate ceasefire. I mean, it might have been maybe the good cop, bad cop policy. You see, sure. Biden is the friend, and Kamala Harris says what in the inner room of the White House is being spoken. So I have my doubt. She has a Jewish husband. I don't know if it's a plus or minus. I don't know how much influence he has on her, whether he likes Israel. I don't know. So for me, Biden was the friend of Israel in the White House. I knew Biden in the 70s, since the 70s. He always was a staunch Israeli friend. I don't know about Kamala Harris. I hope so.
Right.
I think the point that Zach
made, you have 10 seconds to make it.
A very important point. The vice president with security portfolio behind him will help her.
All right. Well, we'll see. That's going to be interesting. We'll have plenty of time to talk about the vice presidential selection. Gentlemen, stay with us. We're going out. But lots more coming up in the second half of the rundown. We'll look at unfortunate news coming about the hostages. Stay with us.
Shalom. ¿Qué me trae por aquí? La necesidad impostergable de 600 millones de hispanoparlantes que ahora necesitan escuchar el mensaje judío e israelí en tiempos difíciles. ¿Cómo lograrlo? Cuento con ustedes para continuar llevando a lo más alto del mundo mediático una inquebrantable diplomacia pública al servicio de la verdad sin concesión alguna.
This broadcast is brought to you by Israel Bonds, the most direct and impactful way to support Israel. Invest now at israelbonds.com. This broadcast is brought to you by Israel Bonds, the most direct and impactful way to support Israel. Invest now at israelbonds.com.
Welcome back to The Rundown on I-24 News. The IDF today confirmed the death of 2 Israeli hostages while in Hamas captivity in Gaza. In a statement, the military says 76-year-old Alex Danzig and 35-year-old Yagev Bushtab were killed several months ago and that their bodies are still being held by the terror group in Gaza. The news comes amid a mounting public outcry for the government, in particular Prime Minister Netanyahu, to move ahead on a hostage deal. Sarah Martinez has more in this report.
As Netanyahu prepares to address Congress in Washington, 2 hostage families are in Shiva here in Israel, mourning the death of their loved ones. On Monday, the IDF informed the families of 75-year-old Alex Danzig and 35-year-old Yager Bushtav that both men had died in Hamas captivity and that their bodies are still being held by the terror group in Gaza. Their deaths were determined by a panel of health experts and members of the rabbinate following new information obtained by the Israeli military. Alex and Yagev were believed to have been held together in Khan Yunis, where they died several months ago, while the IDF was operating there. The military is investigating the circumstances surrounding their death, noting the possibility that they were killed by Israeli fire. On October 7th, both men were brutally abducted by Hamas terrorists from their homes in Kibbutz Nirim and Kibbutz Nir Oz along the Gaza border. Yagev, a young musician and sound technician, was kidnapped along with his wife, Rimon. The music and animal-loving couple was held captive together until November, when Rimon was released as part of the first hostage deal. Alex, a farmer and passionate historian, reportedly spent his time in a captivity giving history lectures to fellow captives. Yesterday would have been the grandfather's 76th birthday. For nearly 10 months, Alex's family pushed for aid organizations like the Red Cross to get medicine across to him and other elderly hostages.
My grandfather is an elderly man who is dependent on medicine. From what I understood 2 months ago, now I don't even know if he's alive or dead. I'm praying, and I truly believe with all my heart that he's still alive, but that this is still dependent on medicine, and he isn't getting access to them. Who would have thought that my grandfather would be kidnapped from his home?
The news of their death is particularly emotional for former hostages, like 17-year-old Sarah Calderon, who was released from captivity in November. She says she spent several days with Yagev during her time in Gaza until he was transferred to another location. She blames the state for not saving him. The IDF has now confirmed the deaths of 44 of the remaining 120 hostages held by Hamas. The hostages' families forum says the deaths in captivity of Alex and Yagev is a result of foot-dragging in negotiations and serves as yet another stark reminder of the urgency to seal the current deal on the table before it becomes too late.
May their memories be a blessing. Still with us in studio, former Ambassador Avi Pazner, Reserves Lieutenant Colonel Doron Avital, and our correspondent, Zach Anders. And Doron, let me ask you about this. Coming out on we should note the timing, IDF announcing this, just of course, as Prime Minister Netanyahu is landing in Washington, under a lot of pressure. There were those in Israel who said he should not have gone unless he had a hostage deal done. These stories of these two men were quite known because of Yagev's wife, Rimon, I should add the story that he told her, leave, go, even though I'm going to stay. She was released in the first hostage deal. Alex Stans, a very interesting story, Holocaust historian. Let's talk about the pressure now, how each one of these only adds to the pressure on Prime Minister Netanyahu to move ahead in a deal that involves difficult choices.
It adds to the urgency to seal a deal in this window of opportunity that right now exists. We know that it exists, and I think the question whether it's a speech in the Congress or a deal first, that's not the issue. But in the next few days, after he comes from the Congress, he has to sit with his team, and we have to work it out. I think the time is days or weeks, no more, for sealing a deal. And I think we achieved much of our objectives in Gaza. And when we think about military pressure that surely facilitate the progress in the deal, you have also to use this pressure. I mean, you can't all the time trust the pressure and not, if you want, translate it to success in the hostage deal. So the hostage deal is really the most critical thing that right now is needed.
Right. And Zach, Hamas making claims, saying, as they've said in the past, and we can't take anything they say at face value, that they were killed as a result of Israeli actions in Gaza. But of course, as the circle of Hamas's control over Gaza sort of decreases, and we know they still have dozens of hostages there, we assume they have live hostages, there is part of the risk involved in the IDF attacking these remaining centers of Hamas power.
Right, and it's been said a million times. We don't know where these hostages are held. We don't know at what dark corner of the Hamas tunnel network they could be when this military action is taking place. To your point, we've just found out within the hour that the IDF is moving back into Han Yunis, and it looks like quite a forceful amount of activity within the last few hours there as well. So it continues to, while the Gallant is telling us that the war aims are being met inside Gaza. That does not mean that the activity on the ground is any less than. I mean, this is still every day an active conflict zone of epic proportions.
Right. I'm going to cut back to Khan Yunis in a minute, but I want you.
I believe that the action in Khan Yunis will only help the negotiation on the hostages.
Well, that is the argument Prime Minister Netanyahu says about the military pressure on that. But still, there is a sort of cutoff point in which you say, okay, we've achieved as much as we can. But I do want to ask you, because you've been up close to prime ministers making these difficult decisions in your career. And let's talk about Prime Minister Netanyahu, accused by some of the hostage families of not wanting to make a deal. His supporters say, no, this is the only strategy in which a deal could be reached with Hamas.
You know, Caleb, you have to take into account the political surrounding in which the Prime Minister operates. Yesterday, I think 8 members of his Likud party wrote him a letter against the deal.
Right.
You know that 2 parties of the coalition are against the deal, any deal. So, of course, he has to maneuver. I can understand that. But I think that his trip now to Washington will be very helpful if he meets President Biden and is able to conduct with him a joint strategy on the hostages. And he has to take into account public opinion in Israel, which demands in its majority a deal on the hostages, and the political pressure within his own party and his coalition.
Right, but I should note that reports of other Likud members, ministers, demanding that he make a deal. So it's coming from both sides.
It comes from both sides, and of course, he maneuvers here. I can understand.
What's the most important is the wedge between the political echelon and the army and the military infrastructure, because the military, and I'm talking about also the Mossad and the Shabak, wants a deal. They feel that the deal is possible, and I think we should listen to them and to the public, and less to those extreme politicians. That
hold on a second, because I want to go back to the issue of Khan Yunis, because you had that update of IDF troops active. In fact, there was a spate of Israeli airstrikes on Khan Yunis today. That is, of course, the main urban center in the Gaza Strip's southern half. Palestinian media reporting also that IDF ground forces had begun to advance on the city's Abbasan area. Earlier today, also we should note, the IDF did call on Palestinians to evacuate from eastern Khan Yunis and some other areas that were a part of that designated humanitarian zone. This is following repeated rocket attacks onto southern Israel from that area. And the IDF earlier today, to your point, Zach, on news, had warned it was ready to forcefully operate against terror groups in the Khan Yunis area. But again, Doron, this is the question of, is the job done, or even as much can be done by the IDF for it to cause a pause in fighting that could cause a regrouping of these Hamas battalions? Because we see Hamas still has active forces.
Hamas has capacities. It's not, you don't win a war by eliminating all the capacities of the enemy. You don't win a war by killing all your enemy soldiers. It's never like this. In the end, it ends with some terms, okay? So we reached some major objectives in Gaza. A hostage deal in this moment right now is possible. We have to go for it, and then we'll see what's next. But this is necessary.
But the army has said from the beginning that there will be a period of time that they will have to enter every time into Gaza in another spot in order to clean it from the Hamas.
The new strategy is to follow over intelligence and do those raids, like in Khan Yunis right now. We don't know what do they know and what do they follow, whether it's leaders, whether it's weaponry, and whether it's some hostage issue. There's no telling. We don't know it here in the studio. But I'm saying a military pressure, of course, can facilitate a deal, but in the end, as you said, there has to be a point in which you say, okay, the deal is here, let's follow it, let's take the risk and do it.
30 targets today by Air Force jets and artillery hit of terrorist infrastructure sites. The IDF says that's a significant surge.
Right, could be a special operation. It could be the IDF trying to do as much as it can ahead of a possible pause or ceasefire.
If you run to some ceasefire, you only want to maximize your achievements.
I think that's the military pressure we are talking about.
Right. Well, now I want to focus on an unusual attempted terror attack, not inside Gaza, but just outside Gaza, in the Israeli border community of Netiv HaAsara, which is just north of the Gaza border barrier. The IDF confirms that the attacker, you see the footage there, who tried to stab troops stationed at the entrance of the community earlier today, was a Canadian citizen who entered Israel on Sunday on a tourist visa. His name is, at least on the passport, Kawashi Zakaria Adam, and he arrived at the entrance of the Gaza border community, Netiv HaAsara, by car. He got out. He threatened security forces with a knife, supposedly was screaming, "Children are being murdered in Gaza." The troops returned fire as he ran at them with a knife, killing him. The IDF, as I said before, saying he arrived from a tourist visa. I want to stress, we don't know actually if he's Canadian. He came in on a Canadian passport. He's as a citizen. There hasn't been reports identifying him as living in Canada. But there is Zach, there was a case a few months ago where a Turkish tourist in Jerusalem who came to Israel apparently to carry out a terror attack and was killed and neutralized here. So again, this is something the security forces will have to examine, even a new possibility.
And we are complaining that tourists are not coming to Israel.
Okay, Avi. Well, that aside, an unusual case here, but it's clearly something that the Israeli security, at least the border authorities, are going to have to start taking a closer look at.
Yeah, and on the Israeli channels, they're reporting that he had what they initially thought was an American accent. Obviously, American Canadians sound very similar, North American. This is very interesting. And as you look at the location, especially the gate in particular where the shooting took place, I've been in this area. If I hadn't been to Israel before, I could certainly think that I was very close to the actual gate, that was the actual fence. But you look at a map from the satellites and you still know that there's the community there before the fence itself to get into Gaza. Was this an attempt, I guess is the point, to get into Gaza? Was this an attempt to kill Israeli soldiers on the Gaza border fence?
That's a good point. He might have thought that that fence was going into Gaza.
And we have to take into account the atmosphere of incitement in Canada and the US in the campuses. I mean, you don't know how young people react to all the lies they hear or they see on Instagram, and this might be one of the results.
It might be, but again, we don't know that. We don't have the information of where he has been living. He could have been someone with a Canadian passport but living somewhere else.
Yeah. We should still make the point too that when I do my reportage in the States, that there's a phenomenon of suicide by cop, where you charge at a police officer, obviously you become a threat to their life, and they have to kill you. So this is a young man who charged with a knife at a soldier with a gun. Okay, I think everything from that.
Well, it's a phenomenon we've seen, for example, in the West Bank, Judea, and Samaria.
Quite common.
It's been quite common among
even women are attacking soldiers with knives.
Right, in order
to make this journey all the way to Israel, to make a point, certainly, but obviously a very troubled young man still at the end of the day.
All right, well, perhaps it'll become, in the next couple of days, we'll learn more about who this individual actually was. Let's move now from the south of Israel to another active front, the north of Israel, where, of course, Hezbollah continues to try to launch attacks into Israel. And our correspondent there in northern Israel near the Lebanon border, Robert Swift, I hate to use phrases like relatively quiet, Rob, but the IDF also, interestingly, having some success, it seems, in shooting down some of these drones that Hezbollah and other terror groups have been launching, with, unfortunately, some effectiveness in some cases, into Israel over the past few months.
Yeah, it has been a day with periods of quiet and a couple of periods of quite intense action. The interception that you referred to this morning, around about 7 o'clock, there was 7 drones across the border, and all of them appear to have been intercepted successfully. But that's not the only interception that took place. About an hour ago, when I was speaking to one of our colleagues during our last hit, an interception took place there just as we were wrapping up the conversation. And subsequently, we've learned that was what appears to have been an IDF Iron Dome missile intercepting a drone that was in the sky a bit to the east of Kiryat Shmona, from what we could tell during that event. Subsequently, there's been a couple more attacks. There's been 2 barrages of rockets towards Kiryat Shmona and the surrounding areas, which appears to be, from initial reports, about 10 rockets fired, with 2 of them appearing possibly to have landed in the area. No confirmation yet as to whether that was landing in open areas or somewhere more significant. At around about the same time as those launches of rockets, it was also, from what we can tell from initial reports, it appears that there was at least 1 or 2 anti-tank missiles have been fired towards 2 of the villages close to Kiryat Shmona, Metula and Margliot, being fired upon there. Again, at the minute, this is just coming in the last few minutes, and we don't have any information with regards to damage there, but we will, of course, update as more information comes in.
All right, Robert Swift there by the northern border. Maybe I should be careful when I use phrases such as relatively quiet. Robert, thank you for that. I want to talk a bit about, I mentioned, because successful interceptions of drones, the IDF apparently going back to some older technology, basically using a flak, what we would call a flak gun. I think it's called the Vulcan.
The Vulcan from, yeah.
Right, which is actually an old piece of equipment dating back where, and they're using it as kind of like flak guns in World War II, where you just shoot up a lot of bullets in the air and you hope you hit a drone, but it seems to have been effective.
Yeah, that's the way Britain was protected in World War II, so we can protect against the drone. This is a new landscape of war, and you all the time learn the enemy, learn the technology, and sometimes all technology proves itself in those contexts, and there was all the time this cry to use it from people that knew this kind of weaponry from the air defense system.
So why wasn't it used?
Because it takes time to take such a thing, utilize it, check, see that it works.
Because it hasn't been used in combat situations in so many years.
You need people that know how to operate it and so on. It's interesting, not only here, Ukraine, Houthis, whatever, a new landscape of war. Everybody is learning the new landscape, learning the new technology, and trying to think how to defend against those new technologies.
Yeah, it happens in every war. In every war you have surprises on the other side, and you have to learn how to make.
I'm still waiting for my opportunity to see the laser beam. I have been wanting.
It will take some time.
Still wrong about
First of all, the Iron. I mean, in the beginning, in the inception of the Iron Dome, there were those people that were talking all the time about the laser beam and saying this is the only possible venue to operate. And in the end, Iron Dome proved itself successfully in a magnitude that surprised all of us.
For our viewers, this is a system that fires basically a laser.
Yeah, exactly. But this
at small, low-flying aircraft such as drones.
And this technology improves itself, the laser beam, and I'm sure they will find it in one
day. I will be in the north.
They say it will be ready by next year.
Okay. Well, hopefully, perhaps the situation resolved by then. But let's bring it back to diplomacy for a minute and Prime Minister Netanyahu's visit to Washington, because clearly that one of the issues that's going to be raised by Prime Minister Netanyahu is the situation in the north, concerns of an escalation there. Earlier at the beginning, following October 7th, the U.S. deploying aircraft carriers to try to restrain Hezbollah. Unfortunately, we've seen examples in which the war has threatened to expand, and it did with the Houthis, with Iran firing its missiles directly on Israel. And, of course, Prime Minister Netanyahu is going to say behind this all is Iran, and dealing with Iran is going to take and all of its proxies is going to take a tougher policy from the United States towards Iran.
He's certainly going to say that, and I am sure he's going to raise the nuclear issue too, because Iran may be days or weeks away of producing a nuclear bomb. So, I mean,
the enrichment, yes, not in terms of the
enrichment.
Yeah, enrichment, yes, but weaponry, not.
And the United States is the only power on earth that can really deter the Iranian. I mean, we can, to some extent, also cause damages, but we need if we want to stand up to Iran and its cronies, we need the United States solidly behind us. Now, Biden will still be president for the next 7 months, we need the United
But Zach,
States.
I'm not sure the president wants to leave office with the U.S. embroiled. The man who pulled the U.S. out of Afghanistan was going to want to further embroil the United States in a Mideast conflict, potentially with Iran in his last months in office.
To your point, I would have to imagine then that Netanyahu, after learning that J.D. Vance has been selected as Trump's running mate, J.D. Vance said after being selected that if we're going to address Iran, that we need a gloves-off moment when it comes to Iran, that we need to tackle them head on. He's not an interventionist when it comes to Russia, Ukraine. He's parroted Russian talking points about pulling out and not being involved, sending money and resources, but has been very staunch and a hawk on Iran. So I would have to imagine that Netanyahu is excited about the opportunity to maybe one day meet with a J.D. Vance vice president.
Well, he may meet him with, even in this, we don't know, at some point in this current trip. But again, he doesn't know who's going to be in the White House. That's much more of a question today, I would think, than it was yesterday. No matter.
I just would say this is a coalition game. We can't just, as Israelis come with demands from the U.S., we have to be constructive players in participating in the overall strategy that the U.S. tries to offer the region. And I hope Netanyahu would be such a constructive player. I suspect, I would say I'm not sure.
Okay, well, we're going to have to have that as the last word for Doron Avital, Ambassador Avi Pazner, our own Zach Anders. Thank you for joining us. And ending on a different note, the Dead Sea is one of Israel's and, of course, one of the world's natural wonders. But the Dead Sea can be deadly. In the past 3 months, 20 people have been rescued from its waters, with 2 fatalities. Now, while the heavy salt content of the Dead Sea makes you float on its surface instead of sinking, those statistics reveal that floating alone may not ensure your safety in its murky waters. More on that in this report from I-24 News.
Is the lowest place in the world, a summer attraction for thousands who are sometimes unaware of the dangers that exist in the water.
It's nothing new, hearing of a drowning in the Dead Sea. It sounds extreme, but we know and see that anyone can drown here. While there's no typical drowning, inhaling water while floating can provoke a reaction that is very dangerous. The damage occurs quickly, and first aid must be provided within minutes. Otherwise, it becomes irreversible.
Since the beginning of the bathing season 3 months ago, 2 people have lost their lives in the Dead Sea. Earlier in July, a man around 70 was pulled from the water unconscious, and despite resuscitation efforts, he did not survive.
This usually happens due to panic. Often, it's the elderly who are affected. A race against time begins. From experience, we know that even if a patient initially feels fine, the situation can become critical in minutes.
People float on their backs, but if they roll over and swallow water, it becomes difficult to return to a floating state. We have a public address system that announces safety instructions in 4 languages every few minutes.
At the beginning of July, a group of tourists drifted in the water in the evening. They were finally rescued with the help of various forces, including Unit 669. One tourist was hospitalized in serious condition.
It's very dangerous.
Since the start of the bathing season, 203 people have been pulled from the water in various locations. 20 of them were rescued from the Dead Sea alone.
The Dead Sea, with its unique properties, is not for swimming like a pool or a normal sea. While it allows you to float on your back, even a small sip of its water is very dangerous and damaging. The Dead Sea is good for the skin, but safety is paramount. We have a professional rescue team. Do not enter the Dead Sea outside of bathing hours, and always listen to lifeguards' instructions.
The sea holds many dangers, even if it seems that floating prevents drowning. It is crucial to heed safety instructions. They can save lives.
It's a great experience floating in the Dead Sea, but for me, it's something you do once in your life. That ends our program for this evening. Of course, you can continue to follow us on our website and all our social media platforms. We'll be back tomorrow with another program. As always, when I can, I'd like to say, let's see the hostages freed as soon as possible. And if you can, catch the rundown.